Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to see faces that I recognize and excited to meet people that I don't. This day is like a culmination and celebration of the daily app, but the shir that I'm about to give is open to people who have been, it should hopefully meet the needs of people who've been studying with us daily and for those who haven't been studying on a regular basis with us. So that's my plan. If you don't know me, I live in Yerushalayim, I live in Jerusalem, and I teach at Pardes on the year program. I teach Mishnah, Talmud, and Halacha. And I really, really, really love learning Mishnah. It's the thing that really the main thing that excites me. And so our evening today is, or it's evening for me, our day today is going to be spent, we have an hour and a half together, a little less than that now. I'm going to give a short 5 to 7 minute introduction, and then we're going to jump into Chavruta because the main thing is for you to engage with the text. And I have a long sheet you see, but there's guided questions, and then we'll come back and have about a 40-minute discussion together about the text. So that's my plan. I think best for me, I'm happy to take questions, but if you know how to use the raise the hand button or just physically raise your hand, I guess now I can see everyone, so we'll be okay. All right, so that's my short introduction. I love learning Mishnah because for me, it's more than just the law book or the oral law. It really is a window, I think, into the theology and philosophy of the rabbis. And you can really unpack that by looking at the way the themes that the rabbis discuss, the specific language and literary themes that appear within each tractate, each chapter. And for those who have been listening with me on the app, that's what I hoped I was giving you a taste of, and I hope that I'll give you a taste of that this evening. So we're going to look at 2 mishnayot quickly together as an introduction, and then we're going to do chavruta mostly on what I would call the 2nd chapter of Mishnah Rosh Hashana. So that's the plan for right now, everyone together. So I hope we know what we're doing. And okay, so I'm going to start. I'm sharing my screen to the source sheet. If you don't have it, that's the Zoom. Here's the source sheet. So in this type of scenario, I can't see everyone. So if you do have a question, if you can do the raise the hand button, that would be helpful to me. Okay, so this is my short introduction is this. The Tractate of Mishnah Rosh Hashana, which has 4 chapters in it, opens with a very famous Mishnah that says, Arba'a Rashei Shanim Hem, that there are 4 heads of the year. And this is shocking because you think a head of the year or a beginning of the year, a new year should only be 1. But the emphasis is clearly on the number 4. And even in Mishnah 2, which we'll look at in 1 second, there is an emphasis on the number 4. And it's clear that there is an idea to tell us that there isn't something singular, but that there's a combination of things happening here. And in this first Mishnah, when it lists the 4 Rashei Shanim, obviously, we could talk about it in depth, and my goal is not to do that here. If you want to do that, you can listen to the app. And the 4 heads of the year, you can sort of divide them into 4 categories. And the first one is related to human beings. It mentions it's the head of the year. Nisan is the head of the year for Jewish kings and for the pilgrimage holidays. And the second one is linked to animal life, Maaser Behema, the tithe of cattle, sheep, goats, which is related to the birth cycle of those animals. When they are born, about the birthing season is when we tithe them. And the third one is linked to to agriculture, to the sabbatical year, to the time of planting of trees. And the fourth one is linked to what I would say is similar to the animals, the fruit of the tree, the birth of the growth and birth of vegetable life, or not, I shouldn't say that, plant life. I should say plant life. And we see, it seems, that the emphasis is so we have 1 related to human beings, 3 related to nature, and the emphasis seems to be, if we look at the one on human beings, which is Jewish kings and the pilgrimage festivals. When we think of the pilgrimage festivals in Nisan, we think of Passover and the birth of the Jewish people and nationhood, and obviously nationhood is linked to having a king. And it seems to be that the emphasis that this Mishnah wants to focus on, and I'm saying this quickly though, is that the divine provides the gift of life to the world, right? That there is the birth of a nation, there's the birth of animals, the birth of plant life, and the fruit of plant life. And that same theme continues in the second Mishnah of the chapter, where it says there are 4 joints or parts to the year. It's interesting to me, and this is focused on where I want to go. It's interesting to me that we have the word Rosh, head, we have the word Regalim, legs, and the word Prakim, joints, all of which are being used in other formats, right? They're not talking about the parts of a human body, but they happen to all be the skeleton of a human body, right? We have the head and we have the legs and we have the joints, and that is a physical description of human beings. And my focus in the second chapter is to really think about what the rabbis are saying about human beings' role in this world. So we already see a hint of that at play here. And the second Mishnah says there are 4 times when the whole world is judged, when the entire world is judged. And it goes through the agricultural seasons, linked to our holidays, but it's as opposed to them being national holidays that are maybe linked to going out of Egypt or receiving the Torah, it's linked to the sun agricultural calendar. And we're judged about receiving produce, the fruit of the tree, both of which were in the first Mishnah. And then there's this very interesting line about our Rosh Hashana. My goal is not to focus on this, but I want to point it out. It says, on Rosh Hashana, our Rosh Hashana, I mean the one that's coming up, the one that we think of as Rosh Hashana, as opposed to all these other 3. It says, Kol ba'ei ha'olam ovrim lefanav, that and it has this very funny phrase, ba'ei ha'olam, the comers of the world, the people that come into the world, the people that come in the world. And this theme is a theme we're going to look at in the second chapter, this phrase, pass before the divine, and the divine can judge them because the divine created them. And this refers to just the way in the first Mishnah we thought about the birth of animal life, the birth of plant life. Now we have the ultimate birth of human life because the day of creation, right, that the divine created them together as one, right, as the source of all humans was the original Adam. And therefore the divine understands human actions. And there is a link, and then finally on Sukkot, we're judged about rain. And there's a funny thing about this Mishnah being a little bit out of order, because obviously you need the rain before you can get the produce, before you're going to get the fruit of the tree, right? It's not the correct beginning. We're talking about beginnings, but this Mishnah isn't presented in the correct beginning. And it seems to be that there is some link between the behaviors and the actions of human beings and how much rain is going to be judged. And that's going to bring us around to the joint work that human beings do to plant and to sow and to grow the plant's life, and then have a yield a very large harvest, or hopefully a large harvest. And these 2 mishnayot, which I know I did very, very quickly, but I just wanted it for like you to have that in the background when we jump into the second chapter, seem to say that there is a link between human beings and the divine. The divine provides life in this world, all forms of life in this world, and then human beings react to that. We bring tithes, we have sabbatical years, and human beings do actions in the world, and the divine reacts to that. We're going to be judged for good or for bad to have water, and then that water we work in combination with nature, human beings plowing the land, sowing the land, and producing life as well. And that's how the entire tractate opens. Where I want to focus on is the second chapter, that when I was doing the daily app, for those who are listening, I noticed something at that time when I was teaching. I was like, I just noticed it, but I didn't have a good idea. And so now I hope I'll suggest a good idea for you. The tractate, as you saw, opened with these 4 heads, and they were heads that were not human heads, even though we think of the word as linked to human head. In the second chapter, that you're going to look at in one moment when we break up into breakout rooms, in the second chapter, we're going to see the word Rosh, head, also is going to be mentioned 4 times, or possibly even 6 times however you want to count it. And they're going to be different types of Roshes. I want to look at what these Roshes are, what these heads are, and see what the Mishnah wants to tell us, right? With this, so already I know that it wants to tell us something about human beings because of this constant focus on human body parts. And you're going to see that in these other 4 rosh, we're going to even finally get the actual physical human head is going to be referred to as a rosh and is really going to be referring to the human head. And so I want to try to unpack that a little. That is my goal. And hopefully I hope that I'll say something about human beings and the divine and the creative spirit and Torah. That's my general idea, to show something specific about those things. So that's our goal together right now. So we're gonna break into breakout rooms. And let me just share the screen so you can see what I want you to do. You have everything in Hebrew and English, so don't worry. I gave you some questions here. It says the second chapter also uses the word Rosh, right, in many different ways. I want you to read through the chapter. How are these heads the same or different than the ones that were used here? Why do you think these heads are mentioned? So it's a lot to read through. Don't get stuck in every little detail. I want you to be looking for these Roshes and to think about them. The second thing I want you to look at is like, what is the role of the rabbis in the courts? What type of behaviors do they do? These to me represent human behaviors. That's the second thing I want you to focus on. And then besides the wisdom of Moshe and the rabbis that are going to be mentioned here, the chapter is going to mention the wisdom of midwives. And there are a number of childbirth references in the chapter. And I want to weave something together or think about what this emphasis on the physical words that describe the human body, the actions of the humans in this chapter, and the references to the actual physical birthing of a human body. And that's what I'm interested in looking at. So those are the questions you should think of when I break you into breakout rooms. It's a lot of material. Do what you can. The main goal is to see the overarching themes through it. I had actually thought that more people would have already seen them together, but it's going to be fine. So you have the mishnayot here. Once you do that, there's also these sources from the Torah that I think give us a hint for what these uses of the word rosh are. And you can look at them here. It's okay if you don't finish it. We will do it together. I wanted to try to, each one of these mishnayot, I could talk literally, and I'm not joking, and for those who listen to that, I could talk for 40 minutes. They made me try to limit it to 15. But and now I'm going to try to talk about something about the overarching structure of all the mishnayot. So I'm not going to be able to explain every detail in every mishnah. I want to show you something about the tale that the chapter, I believe, is telling. And that's my goal here. So you might have questions about some of the mishnayot. If you do, I encourage you to go to Elmad and find that episode on the app, and then you'll hear me explain each mishnah in detail and in depth. So this is talking about sanctifying the new moon, and human beings look up to the sky to do that. I feel like the second chapter is actually really looking at human beings. This is my read, and I hope I'll show that to you. I already told you that the language in the first chapter was talking about all the parts of the human body, but wasn't referring to the human body. And here, we see at the very, very, very end of the chapter, finally, Rabbi Gamliel actually kisses Rabbi Yehushua's head, and we finally have like the human head being mentioned, even though the word head was used throughout the whole time. And in those first two mishnayot that I showed you, we had this funny phrase to call human beings. We called them ba'ei olam, the comers in the world, right? And it's a really bizarre kind of phrase to use. And in this second chapter, we actually have the word ba happen a ton of time. It's the word to describe the witnesses coming to give testimony. It's like in those two stories at the end of the Mishnah, right? It says ma'aseh sheba'u shtayim. There's a ma'aseh, there's an action. If you remember, we're being judged about our actions, and now there's a story that's called a ma'aseh, where two witnesses come, but literally throughout the whole thing, the verb is lavo or ba, right? When they want to encourage the witnesses to come again, and that's why they're giving them all these feasts and festivals, right? We say we want them to be regilim lavo, that they should be used to coming, right? And it's clear that the word ba is the word for what these witnesses do. And then we also see that the midwife, who I want to talk about it, right? She comes. I can share my screen. That's me trying to email the thing. She she comes, everyone should be able to see the screen, right? Right, she is hachachma haba'ah, she's the one who comes. Then the person who, this is the one who comes to save people, right? It's, this word coming is repeated throughout. And in the very end of the Mishnah, we have the bracha that he gives, right? When Rabbi Yeshua comes to him and he says, Bo b'shalom, right? And when he decreed, he said, I want you to come with your stick and money staff. And then when he comes, he says, he tells him to Bo b'shalom. I just point this out because we were introduced to this concept of human beings being the comers, and now this whole chapter, next chapter, just, and I tried doing this. You don't find, it's obviously it's a verb that happens, but it's not a verb that happens. Like if you go to the third chapter where it's talking about shofar, the word ba doesn't appear over and over and over and over again. And so I see that all these descriptions of human beings are these are the comers of the world. They're human beings that are looking to the sky to give testimony about the new moon. There are midwives who are coming to give birth. There are people who are coming to save people's lives from fires and from rivers. There are rabbis that are coming to see one another after arguments. And to me, that's part of the showing that the focus wants to be talking about human beings. The next thing that I noticed about human beings is that if we like sort of go through the flow of the chapter, you see a lot of things about human beings. What do I mean by this? The first Mishnah of the chapter, which we could have also talked, right, for 40 minutes about, we find out that there are other sects, right? They're sectarian sects. There are the Samaritans. There are other sects who are in the time period of the Mishnah, right? So we're talking about other Jews who believe differently, right? So the first thing we're told in the beginning of this chapter is that there are Jews who have different views about Torah, about how to understand Torah, which to me is very, very interesting, right? In that very first Mishnah, we have the rabbis make a takana, they make a decree. They make an adjustment, they fix something in Torah. So we know throughout the whole, and that phrase about them making a takana, an adjustment, a fixing, is going to happen 3 times in our chapter. So we know that rabbinic Judaism, that they have views and understand Torah in a specific way, right? But also, apparently there are other human beings who have views and understand Torah in a way, right? So there's us and them in the Jewish people about being interpreters of Torah, right? We might argue that these other groups are misinterpreting Torah. They might be using a sun calendar, not a moon calendar. We won't get into the details of what their challenging is, but the chapter opens that there seems to be an understanding about that human beings have, that their job is to interpret Torah, and interpreting Torah means taking Torah and like making it real in your life. Like, what's my calendar going to look like? How do I put this into a daily functioning? And that I then have such strong views about my view of a Torah, I might want to, I know this might surprise you, that some Jews have such strong views about their views about Torah that they might try to influence other groups of Jews that they want them to behave like their thing. So I might send witnesses to the rabbis to give testimony that will coincide with the calendar that I want. Or I might hold up torches on the top of a mountain to coincide with the calendar that I want. And because of this, then the rabbis have to make adjustments, and they have to do decrees and takanot to adjust so that their interpretation of a Torah gets played out in life. And that is like the opening to this chapter, right? You might have thought the opening was just about the technicalities of, this is what I mean, that if you haven't learned Mishnah with me, I'm looking for like the meta themes and ideas that come out of the technicality of the law. So we open with this idea that human beings are supposed to interpret and can have views on how Torah is played out in life. I want to pause. I'm going to skip the torches for 1 second. I'm going to come back to them. We find out in source number. I guess it's probably best for me to show my screen again, right? We find out also that that human beings and this seems like a side note, but we realize it's going to be important, right? Another one of these takanot, right? So we have two, we open up with the rabbis making a decree, a fix, right? Two fixes that they make. Then there's a description of how it was before the fix, and then we get told about another fix that another decree the Rabbi Gamliel Hazaken makes, and then we learn about human beings here that they can get frustrated if they're not giving the right respect, right? And then we find out that human beings do other really incredible things. They save people's lives or they bring life into this world, and this seems like an afterthought here. But yet we know that it's a theme that gets repeated. For sure, this midwife theme gets repeated. So we find out that human beings are the bringers of life in this world. And if we think about those first two mishnayot about the birth of animals and the birth of plant life here, and I implied the birth of human beings when they were created at the beginning of time. But now we have a reference to the birth of human beings that happens throughout the world all the time. And human beings come and they do life-saving acts. They can save you from a river if you're drowning. They can save you from a fire. They can save you if your building's about to collapse. And so human beings have really the power to bring life to this world in two ways, we find out. Right, human beings obviously ask questions. They clarify things. They see and understand things in different ways. And misunderstand things in different ways. That's definitely a theme here, that there are people who can misunderstand things. And then we see sort of smack in the middle of this chapter, something very interesting, that human beings through their speech can sanctify, can create sanctity in this world, right? It's definitely, we're going to come to the theme of the heads in a second, but it's definitely headed, right? The head of the court, and the court itself is important, but we have the entire nation. We have all the people, right? The entire nation, the Am, who are echoing that mekudash, that sanctified that they're bringing into the world. And in this story with Rabbi Gamliel, we see that some human beings have more knowledge, right? Rabbi Gamliel seems to understand all the sky, and he has charts and tables. Not like me, I don't fully understand the sky at all. But then there are people called hedyot, people who are unlearned, and they don't fully understand it. And that causes people sometimes to make mistakes. Either we don't know if these Edei Shek are these people who are false witnesses or lying witnesses. We don't know if they're linked to those people in the beginning of the chapter who on purpose were trying to deceive people, or if they're people who just like, they didn't fully understand what they were seeing and there was a cloud and they're not as learned as Rabbi Gamliel, and they don't get it. And obviously we see that human beings have different voices and different opinions, and they can disagree. And there's definitely an issue about asserting power and whose voice, whose davar and voice words are we going to listen to. And so I see throughout the chapter there is this focus and emphasis on how human beings interact with other human beings, right? There's definitely also an emphasis on the connectedness between human beings. Do I know you? Do I not know you? How do I get information to you? Sending messengers out, and how human beings function in the world. Not just how the rabbis do, which I think is definitely, but just people in general, the Ba'ei Olam, the people that come into this world. Which leads me to noticing, and I noticed this only because I taught on this app that you've now heard a million times exists, that in the second chapter, the word Rosh, which is this word that was introduced to me from Rosh Hashana, which I thought was a human word, which in the first chapter didn't refer to human beings at all, suddenly appears quite a few times throughout this chapter. And here too, I would like to tell you, it's not by chance. You can look at other chapters in Mishnah, and the word Rosh does not appear so many times. It's here in Mishnah Rosh Hashana that it appears so many times. And what were the 4 times, right? What were the 4 times that we saw it? We saw Rosh Hahar. We saw Rosh, right, the head of the mountain. We saw Rosh Dvarim, like there it meant a little bit, like it technically translated means the first of the words, but it meant like an outline of things, right, to make sure that they still felt like someone cared about them coming. We saw Rosh Beitin, the head of the Beitin, and then we saw the physical Rosh, the actual head of Rabbi Yoshua that got kissed, right? So here it's interesting to me, if I compare it to the first chapter where I said that there were 3 Roshes Rosh Hashanahs that were about nature, and one was about humans, right? In both Mishnah 1 and Mishnah 2 that I did in my introduction, 3 are about nature and 1 was about humans. In our 4 Roshes here, 3 of them are about humans, human speech, human head of institutions, human physical head, and 1 is about nature, the head of the mountain. So I see nice symmetry there. And so what is going on with these Roshes? What does the Mishnah want to tell us with Rosh? Does anyone have a thought, or you saw? I don't know if you got in your chavrutas to where I want to go with these Roshes, but any thoughts? Yes, Shira.
Oh,
Unmute yourself, Shira.
This Shira?
Yes. Okay,
great. One thing that we just started to touch on in our chavruta before we moved on, and this was related to how all of the Rosh references connect to Rosh Hashanah, is one of my chavruta mates, I think Mr. Grossman perhaps, but I'm not sure, suggested that it relates to the idea of the king being in the field during Elul, and how every time Rosh is referenced, it's about like the beginning of something or fixing something, or I don't know, I think maybe you could articulate it a little bit better than I could, but we kind of started to converge on this idea that it all relates to the way that we can connect with God, that like the Rosh Beit Din is kind of the connector between God and the people in terms of law, and the head is where people can connect to God like the most, in opposition to like your arm or something like that. And the idea of judges, and then of the years starting, that they all kind of have this theme of connectedness to God, and that relates to Rosh Hashanah through that idea.
Carol, what did you want to add?
yeah, I was going to say the Rosh Hahar in Exodus that's where Moshe, God comes down and Moshe goes up, and that's where the human and the divine can meet.
Yeah, but Ruth, you want to add something? Unmute yourself, Ruth.
I guess it's 2 parts. One is, do you think when they say Rishonah, it's related to the concept of Rosh? Because if so, I guess I would say then it's used very differently, because they're not always doing things the way they were doing things in the first times, and they made significant departures. And I just thought that was interesting.
So I was a little torn by this. In the first chapter, I brought you the first 2 mishnayot that have 4 as the significant number. If you keep reading the first chapter, it switches that 6 is the significant number. Mishnah Gimel emphasizes 6. And when you look at this chapter, you have the 4 Roshes that are really unique Roshes that we've mentioned: the head of the Rosh Hahar, Rosh Dvarim, Rosh Beitim, and Rosho. But then you have Rishonah, like originally or at first, and you have Rishon when the 2 Eidim come, meaning the first one to come. So I'm not sure about that, because there's a 4 that seems distinct, and then there's a 6, and I don't know if that was also a play that was happening similar to the parallel to the first text. I have something to say a little bit that maybe will relate to the Rishonah, right? The Rishonah shows us, and for those who are learning the whole Masechet, this appears again in the 4th chapter, the idea that there's sort of always like a beginning, the way that the divine wanted it in some way, and then something happens in human history, sometimes maybe the Korban, maybe these other groups, and then human beings have to react to that, and they have to make a fix, right? We talked about this, Ruth, I think you were with us when we did. I don't remember which class you were in, but you have to make a fix, and it's human reaction, and therefore the passage of time. What's interesting about Rishonah is Rishonah describes a linear passage of time, where the beginning of Rosh Hashanah was really talking a lot about cycles of time, which maybe I'll say something about that at the end of coming back, that maybe we're hoping for a cycle of time to come back to the ideal state. I've said it now. All right, yes, Carol.
It seems that a lot of the references to Rosh have to do with intellectual activities, judging, observing, keeping a calendar. I don't see a sense of regish here.
So Yafeh, if you, emotion, she said she didn't see any emotion. So if you want the emotion, go to chapter 3 of Mishnah Rosh Hashana, where you'll have Kavanat Halev. And I mean, that's another, if we're talking about broad themes for those people who are learning the whole chapter, it's definite that the beginning is taught, the first 2 chapters are very focused on the Rosh, and the second chapters are function a lot on the Kavanah and the use of the word Lev. Although in that Mishnah 2, we saw Rosh and Lev combined, where it's God creates their hearts and knows their actions. And so already those 2 aspects were lined up. I do believe that you're correct that the emphasis on the head here is about wisdom, is about knowledge, is about knowing. And we'll come to that in 1 second. Okay, I'm sharing the screen again. And I know we're doing this quickly. I felt that and I could be wrong, right? This is just interpretation. To me, the Rosh Hahar very much reminded me of Har Sinai. First of all, when it's first described, right, the Har is basically on fire, right? There's smoke and a thick cloud and fire. And the description of the Masoot are actually of mountains on fire. I mean, and the description of those torches is a very powerful description of like, of the in some ways the chain of tradition of the Torah being spread to the diaspora, right? Going out from Jerusalem, and then the fire lights fire, and you like see the passage of this revelation of when the month is, and you have an imagery of a burning mountain. So these psukim, I wanted to show you that the mountain was burning, and then specifically right here, the Torah itself uses this phrase, right? Vayirei Hashem al Har Sinai el Rosh Hahar, right? That the divine descends on Mount Sinai, on the head of the mountain, and then he calls Moshe el Rosh Hahar, right? So the rabbis who are so well versed in biblical language, when they use Rosh Hahar, I think they think that when we hear that, we are going to think of Mamad Har Sinai, especially with a burning mountain on fire, a mountain on fire, we're going to think of Har Sinai. And then what's interesting to me, that the word Rosh Dvarim, right, which in the way it's being used in the Mishnah is talking about an outline or just the scheme of things or just the most important things. In the experience of Sinai, the concept of Dvarim is very important, right? The Aseret HaDibrot, right? We say it in the feminine, so maybe we did right, but Hashem is going to speak, whatever exactly that means. Possibly, I mean, this is another thing that we're not really discussing here. Possibly, that God's voice is the voice of the shofar. It sounds a little bit like that, but right, the voice of the shofar gets stronger and stronger. Moshe speaks, and the divine answers b'kol, and the only kol we have is b'kol shofar, but that's food for thought, right? And the divine utters dvarim, and they're dvarim that are said to us, right? And I didn't list all the 10 dvarim, right? But it's Sarah Dibrot, but I wanted to say that. And then the emphasis is on this idea, right? That the Jewish people listen to every kol asher diber Hashem, that to everything that the divine uttered, spoke, said, and then we're going to make a covenant al kol hadvarim ha'ela. We make a covenant on all these things, right? And then comes the verse that gets quoted in our Mishnah that we'll come back to in 1 second, about Moshe and Aaron going up in the Har with it, right, which is in reference in our chapter, was used in reference to the court. So we have a Rosh Har, and we have the first Dvarim, which maybe is I am the Lord your God, right? And in fact, I have the phrase Rosh Dvarecha used in Tehillim, in Psalms, right? To refer to the divine speaking to us. It in fact we say this verse before shofar blowing, which is another link that possibly that the rabbis think that possibly the shofar is similar to the divine's voice. Meaning the fact that we choose to say this verse in the liturgy before shofar blowing. But here I have that very phrase, Rosh Dvarecha. And because I didn't want to fill up this source sheet too much, but if you look at all the commentaries, they think it's referring to the Aseret HaDibrot, to the 10 Commandments, to the first thing that the divine uttered to us, right, on Har Sinai. Or possibly, was interesting to me, this is another thought I had, I don't want to confuse you if we can hold lots of thoughts, right? Or maybe the Rosh Dvarecha that the divine says to us is the first mitzvah that we ever get, right? We have a lot of narrative in Sefer Shmot, and then the first mitzvah that we get, the Rosh, the first one, the first time the divine gives us a statement is about the new moon, right? Chodesh Hazeh Yeh Lechem. This month shall be the Rosh Chodeshim. So I don't know. To me, it's I'm juggling either one of these things. I'm juggling either one of these things. But to me, the Rosh Dvarim sounds like the Dvarim that the divine say to the Jewish people. So if I have Rosh Hashana and I have Rosh Dvarim, it sounds like that the chapter wants to talk to me, and then I have a verse in the end, right, the last Mishnah of the chapter, which is describing Moshe on Har Sinai. It sounds like the chapter wants to talk to me about the revelation of Torah in this world, right? If we're talking about the divine giving life forces and being the creator of the world, right? The divine is the creator and force of Torah, the life force of Torah in this world. And so then I have that very interesting imagery, but totally juxtaposed with this human revealer of Torah, right? The courts, the rabbis themselves, right? The fact that they are making takanot, that they are making decrees and fixes to the law and readjusting it. The fact that they are sanctifying months and holidays, and then I see something else that's to me very, very interesting, right? And that the very verse in that last Mishnah, right? The whole reason why Rabbi Yoshua is in the end willing to accept Rabbi Gamliel's authority, right? He's distressed, extremely distressed. Rabbi Akiva doesn't help him feel better, and finally he comes to Rabbi Joseph ben Horkanus, and the pasuk is this pasuk, that same pasuk that I just showed you about Moshe going up with Nadav and Avihu and the 70 elders. And the idea is, because those elders are anonymous, that any court in later human history is equal to the court of Moshe Rabbeinu, i.e. is equal to the receiver and revealer of Torah to the Jewish people. All right, and that comparison is made explicitly in the use of the verse. And then I started to notice that the word dvarim is used in a number of ways in the chapter, right? Besides Rosh Dvarim, there is, in this argument between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Gamliel, right? At first, Rabbi Yeshua, when he disagrees with Rabbi Gamliel, he says to Rabbi Horkanus, Ro'ani et dvarecha, I see your words, right? And the very end of the chapter is that Rabbi Gamliel says that you are my student because you accepted my kibalta et dvari, you accepted my davar. And so I have the dvarim that the divine reveals, and I have the dvarim that human beings reveal with their own views and opinions about Torah, right? I mean, and maybe this is obvious, but a lot of this doesn't appear here in this Mishnah, it appeared in the first Mishnah, but a lot of times we say divrei Rabbi Yoshua, divrei Beit Hillel, divrei, right? And we just translate it as these are the words of. But when I see the use of the word davar in this chapter, I really think, oh, this is, like, to me, it's fascinating. I normally have the divine vayadeber, saying words and revealing words. And then I have that juxtaposed with human beings revealing words and saying words, which is their opinions about Torah or their understandings about Torah. Okay, I have about 7 minutes left. I want to connect this to the midwife. The midwife who she thought it was like she was tacked on, right? Rabbi Gamliel made a decree to help the witnesses. And then it said, and by the way, this also helps midwives and also helps other people who are saving people's lives, right? And it seemed like it was tacked on, except for the fact that then we had imagery about the moon, right? Then we had imagery about the moon that was a pregnant moon. And then even in the conversation, when they were arguing about if the testimony was correct, the moon got compared to a pregnant woman, right? So I have a midwife who comes to help birth. Then I have the moon being compared to birth in some way and pregnancy. And then the midwife was called the chachama, right? The midwife was called a chachama. And then at the very end of the chapter, when Rabbi Gamliel is kissing the head of Rabbi Yeshua, he says that you are my Rabbi b'chokhmah. And I have the same word, chachma used twice in the chapter, which to me is also doesn't happen that often. And I don't have to call the midwife a chachama. There are other words that the Mishnah calls her at other places, achaya and things like that. So what's going on here? What's going on here? This was really troubling me when I was learning the app, and this is the thought I have. Bear with me, what you think. On the one hand, birth, as we saw in the Mishnah Torah, is the magical, natural, divine, however you want to call it, process that whether there's a midwife there or not, it's going to happen. But why is the midwife called a chachama? The midwife is called a chachama because she examined the natural processes and learned from her experiences and then used that information to support and guide the birthing process to a positive outcome, right? It's a process that's going to happen naturally in some way, or that is the divine's process, but the wisdom that human beings have accumulated by their actions, by their experiences, then can make that outcome happen in a better fashion. I hope you'll agree with that description of what the midwife's wisdom was. And that was interesting to me when I compared it to what the court was doing with the new moon, right? And I think I talked about this with one chavruta, and you see it in the Mishnah where there's an argument if the court has to sanctify it or does the divine sanctify it, right? The new moon's gonna come. The new moon's gonna come in a cycle, and it's a natural process or a divine process, however you wanna do it. But yet, human beings, through their knowledge and experience, like those charts that Rabbi Gamliel figured out or whatever, right? They end up guiding it and enabling it and bringing it into some type of sanctity and using the information that they have about it to take this natural process and make it something more better and more sanctified for the Jewish people. And so it was an interesting similarity between the two, because they're both natural processes that you might not have thought human beings need to get involved with, but then human beings get involved with it. And in some ways, we're birthing the new moon, we birth the new month, and that is we're part of that creative life force, and just as the midwife is. Okay, here's my last thing. Mira's supposed to tell me 5 minutes. I think I'm in my 5-minute time. Someone mentioned here that they think that the head is wisdom, which I would agree. I mean, I don't think this is a 100% proof, but I think you see in Greek and Roman myths the same idea, right? Athena is birthed from the head of her father, and she is the goddess of wisdom, because there's an understanding in this time period that the head is the place where wisdom and chokhmah happens, right? And that is where the human beings are using their mind. And so I would like to make this suggestion when there's a comparison where he calls him Rabbi b'chokhmah, right? That on the one hand, Torah is the natural, revealed divine process, the way birth is and the way the moon is, and that you might think that human beings have nothing to do with. But the message of this whole chapter is that the rabbis are like the midwives of Torah, that they are the ones who support and enable Torah to come into this world in a way that it can live, that it can bring holiness, that it can support the lives of people in a fashion that will be powerful, and that they are birthing Torah. And so that to me is the comparison, right? I have Rosh Hashana and Rosh Dvarim, that's the revelation of Torah. And then I have Rosh Beit Din, and then the physical human Rosh. And it's the physical human Rosh of human beings, like we saw in the first Mishnah, even though there are groups that think differently than us, that interprets Torah, that has opinions about Torah, that understands how Torah is going to play out in this world. And that gets put into the court system and ultimately the authority of the Rosh Beit Din to make those decrees and to be part of that birthing process. And that the rabbis Moshe Rabbeinu are parallel, that the two courts are the same, and that we're in this partnership. So just like in the first two mishnayot, we saw a partnership between human beings and the divine in creating produce and creating fruits and creating that life force. And we see with the midwife that there's a partnership between human beings and the divine in the birth process and creating human beings. We see this partnership between human beings and the divine in the revelation and the birth of Torah in this world. And that is an important message, I think, particularly post-destruction, that that natural phenomenon are supposed, or godly phenomenons maybe, are supposed to have human support systems to them. And that it is appropriate for the rabbis to do this. I have 1 second left. Give me 1 second. You maybe didn't get to this in your last, in your chavruta, and this is a Mishnah at the very, very, very end of the entire tractate. And maybe I'll encourage you to learn it on your own, but it's a Mishnah about shofar. And it repeats all the themes that we saw in the second chapter about expanding the domain of where you can go, about we had someone coming to save you if your house fell down, and this is a shofar that's buried under rocks. We have the tree and we have the behemah, and these are all rabbinic mitzvot, rabbinic decrees, that to fulfill a biblical mitzvah, you cannot override rabbinic decrees, it says. And in some ways I wanna, maybe this is a little bit of blasphemous, but if the shofar is the voice of the divine, this Mishnah basically is saying the voice of the divine is in some ways subservient to the voice of the rabbis. Whether you understand the technicalities or not, these are entire lists of rabbinic mitzvot that I cannot transgress in order to do the shofar. And then our text actually explicitly says that that there is an equality between things that are forbidden from rabbinic prohibitions and things that are forbidden from biblical prohibitions are equal. I use the word things because it uses the word davar, which is referring to specific things, but it harkens back to the davar of our chapter where the word of, the opinion of, that the davar of the rabbis is equal to the davar of the divine. So I guess my blessing to you at this time period, and this is the end, is that for those of you who are doing the app and for those of you who are just doing some pre-Rosh Hashana learning right now, that to celebrate your learning and to know that we as human beings have the power to birth new Torah, which will be part of this continuing chain, like that chain that goes forth from Jerusalem, and that will link us back to the court of Moshe Rabbeinu and to the experience of Har Sinai. And particularly in this time of COVID, where we're maybe needing to make adjustments, and it's not like it was Berishonai, like it was originally. And we're learning on Zoom, and we're not getting to learn in person. To me, this Mishnah gives me hope that that's part of the birth process of Torah in the world. And even though we have a feeling of how it used to be, and maybe it's not exactly the same, and that was similar to the rabbis post-destruction, but maybe we'll eventually, in the cycle of life that we see that this Mishnah does, we'll get back to the Berishonah, how we were. So Shana Tova to you all. I hope you got a little bit of a taste of what it means to look at a Mishnah in breadth. And I encourage you, if you haven't listened to the app, to go to Elmad and listen to it.